Today we've been asked to simplify some radicals, and we're going to start with the square root of 448. And the way you're going to simplify any radical is to try and find a perfect square that will go into it, since this is a square root. And to remind you, your perfect squares are 4, 9, 16, 25, right? 2 squared, 3 squared, 4 squared, 5 squared. And so I want to pick the largest perfect square that will go into 448. And if I experiment with this a little bit, what I find is 448 is the same as 64 times 7. And our rules for radicals say that we can break that into two separate radicals. 64 times 7. What is the square root of 64? 8. What's the square root of 7? It's not a perfect square, so we leave it under the radical. So anything that's a perfect square, we take the square root and bring it out. Anything that is not a perfect square, we leave it under the radical. And there is our simplified answer, 8 square root of 7. Okay, so we want to go from that. Let's make this a little more complicated. Let's throw in some variables. We have 32x to the 5th, y to the 10th. So again, I'm going to look for perfect squares. And immediately I notice that 32 is the same as 16 times 2. And y to the x to the 5th, what I'm looking at, there's two ways to do this. One is to break it into quantities that you can take the square root of. Well, the square root of x squared, okay, and I'll write this down. The square root of x squared is x, okay? And so I can break this into x squared times x squared times x, right? Because when we multiply, 2 plus 2 plus 1 makes 5. And then, of course, the same thing can be done with y. I can do y squared, y squared, y squared, y squared, y squared, right? 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. Okay? Now ask yourself, what can I take the square root of? Well, the square root of 16 is 4. The square root of x squared is x. The square root of x squared is x. I cannot take the square root of 2. I cannot take the square root of x. Y squared, take the square root, you get y. Y squared, take the square root, you get y. Y squared, take the square root, you get y. And we're going to do this with all 5 of those. What's left in the radical? 2 and x. What's left out is all of this, and I can combine those. X times x is x squared. Y times y times y times y times y is y to the 5th. And that would be your answer. Now there's a shortcut to this that you'll learn. If you do a few of these, you learn very quickly there's a shortcut. And the shortcut is very simply that if you take this number and ask yourself how many times will 2, because that's the index on this radical, 2, how many times will 2 go into 5? Okay? 2 goes into 5 twice with 1 left over. How many times will 2 go into 10? 5 times with none left over. And so that's how we get those answers very quickly and very easily when we have variables. So let's practice this with our third problem. This time we have a cube root. So the first question I have is, what are my perfect cubes? 2 cubed, 3 cubed, 4 cubed, 5 cubed, etc. Well, 2 cubed is 2 times 2 times 2, which is 8. 3 cubed is 3 times 3 times 3, which is 27. 4 cubed is 4 times 4 times 4, which is 64. And 5 cubed is 5 times 5 times 5, which is 125. And the cubes get very big very fast. And so we look and say, okay, well, what will go into 54? Well, this is too big, this is too big, so really I have a couple of choices, either 8 or 27. And it just so happens that 27 goes into 54. So 54 is the same as 27 times 2. And I'm going to write x to the 8th, y to the tenths. Now, I could break these into x to the third times x to the third times x squared, because 3 plus 3 plus 2 is 8. And I could break this into the y to the third times y to the third times y to the third times y. But instead, I'm going to cheat. I'm going to say, how many times will 3 go into 8? And it goes 2 times. With how much left over? Right? 3 goes into 8 2 times with 2 left over. How many times does 3 go into 10? It goes 3 times with 1 left over. And then, of course, I can't take the cube root of 2, so it's going to stay in here. I can take the cube root of 27. The cube root of 27 is 3. And there is your simplified radical. So if you have any questions, please come see me.